Dear Mr. President, dear friends, we are very glad to see you all here in Moscow. Welcome. Your visit today is of particular importance. We will not only have the opportunity to discuss all areas of our cooperation, but we will also sign a major basic agreement between Russia and Iran on a comprehensive strategic partnership.
The agreement that we have in place for the nuclear power station, the work is progressing well, and the related agreement that we have in this area will be finalized during our meetings and will be actioned.
All right, you ready to dive into this whole Russia-Iran thing? I know you're all over this kind of stuff, so let's unpack it. You sent over a bunch of research and articles, and we're going to try to break it all down. We've got Putin and Raisi with this big 20-year agreement, and, well, everyone's trying to figure out what it all means, right? Big power move, or are they feeling the heat? What do you think?
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it? What strikes me is what's actually in this agreement compared to all the speculation flying around.
Right.
Trade, for sure, that's a huge part of it. But the sources you send, they get into the specifics. It's not just generally boosting trade. Russia's looking to really ramp up those energy exports to Iran.
Oh, interesting.
Helps them sidestep some of those pesky sanctions and, brings in some much needed cash.
Makes sense. Cash is king. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of sanctions, you marked this thing, the North-South International Transport Corridor.
Oh, yeah.
Massive railway project. It goes from Russia through Iran all the way to the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
Even connects to India. Talk about a workaround.
It's a game changer, potentially. Not only does it let Russia kind of bypass those Western sanctions, but it could, totally reshape how trade flows across Eurasia.
It's pretty massive when you think about it.
Absolutely.
I'm looking at some of these economic projections, and wow, they're pretty eye-opening. Could be a huge boost for both Russia and Iran, especially if they can actually get it integrated with all the existing infrastructure.
For sure. And, something else you picked up on in the research was this whole nuclear power development piece.
Yeah.
Russia's agreed to help Iran build even more nuclear power plants, on top of the one they already have up and running.
Right. And nuclear power, it's always a bit of a, what do they say, a double-edged sword.
Absolutely.
On the one hand, you've got, the potential for cheap, clean energy.
Yeah.
Get some off those fossil fuels that everyone's always going on about.
Yeah. But there's always a but, right? There are those concerns about what if they misuse the technology, right? Can't just ignore those. I think we have to, really acknowledge those concerns head on. How do you feel about it based on everything you've read?
I don't know. It's kind of unnerving, to be honest. I get the whole energy independence argument, but it's hard to just brush aside those risks. You flagged that article, the one talking about Israel's concerns over this nuclear collaboration.
Right.
Their perspective definitely throws another wrench into the whole thing.
Definitely adds another layer, doesn't it? We got to look at this from all sides. One of the sources you sent, it was an op-ed, I think, by retired Lieutenant General Kellogg. He actually says this whole deal, it's a sign of weakness.
Weakness?
Really?
Yeah.
Not strength. He points to how Russia's struggling in Ukraine, and then you've got Iran with their whole conflict with Israel.
Oh, right. It's almost like they're teaming up because they need each other, not because they're so powerful.
Here? Exactly. They're feeling the pressure and need some backup. It makes you question that whole grand alliance to reshape the world narrative.
Wow, that's a good point. Makes you wonder what they're really after in the long run. Easy to get caught up in all the headlines about challenging the West, but maybe there's more to it than meets the eye.
Right. And, digging into all this research you compiled, there's a clear theme of wanting to challenge that U.S.-led world order. Both countries are pushing for this, what do they call it, multipolar world?
Yeah, break that down for me. Multipolar, what's that all about? Why should we care?
Basically, they want a world where power isn't just in the hands of the U.S. and its allies. They want to see different power centers popping up and, competing on a more even playing field.
Is it like a more distributed balance of power globally?
Exactly. This deal is a step in that direction, creating a counterweight to all that Western influence, both political and economic.
It's not just talk either. Right. We've seen Russia doing similar things with North Korea and Belarus lately, building a network almost, pushing back against the West.
You got it. But here's the thing. This deal with Iran, it doesn't have that mutual defense clause. Unlike the North Korea and Belarus agreements, that's a big difference. Makes you wonder about how committed they really are.
That's a good point. Maybe they're hesitant to go all in with Iran, at least for now. Like, there's still some suspicion there. It's a puzzle trying to figure out what's really driving this whole thing.
Absolutely. And even without that mutual defense thing, they still have those existing military ties.
Right.
Their joint support for Assad in Syria, been a thorn in the West side for years.
Right, right. And then there's the elephant in the room, the war in Ukraine. Iran's been accused of, what was it, supplying Russia with drones? That hasn't exactly helped their relationship with the West.
Definitely not. This agreement could really cement that partnership. But it's important to remember, this isn't happening in a vacuum. You've got both Russia and Iran under those Western sanctions, and they both have a reason to want to shake up the current world order, this deal. It's a way to pool their resources, combine their influence, and make a statement.
So it's a marriage of convenience, but with some deeper ideological roots too. They're not just trying to dodge sanctions. They're trying to rewrite the rules of the game entirely.
You got it. And
Right.
that's what makes this whole thing so potentially disruptive. It's not just playing defense anymore. It's going on the offensive, trying to shape the future according to their own vision.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, we're not playing by your rules anymore. We're going to make our own. And that brings me to something you mentioned before, the whole shared worldview thing. What are the core principles behind that? How do their values and beliefs actually differ from the West's?
It's a big question. You highlighted some sources that get into that. And it really boils down to a few key differences. First off, there's this rejection of that whole Western-style democracy, with all the emphasis on individual rights.
Right.
They're arguing it's a flawed system, that it actually destabilizes things, especially in places with different cultural and historical contexts.
So they're pushing back against this idea that there's one universal model of democracy. Like, what works in the West should be applied everywhere.
Exactly. They're advocating for a more, authoritarian approach,
Right.
prioritizing state power and social order over individual liberties. They often point to, the chaos that followed the Arab Spring
Right, right.
as proof that trying to force democracy from the outside just doesn't work.
I see. So it's not just about, challenging the West's political power. It's about challenging their whole ideological framework, almost a clash of civilizations.
That's a pretty strong way to put it, but there's some truth there. And this clash, it goes beyond domestic politics, too. It affects their foreign policy as well.
You mean their willingness to use military force to get what they want?
Yes, and their disregard for international law or what the West thinks. They're much more pragmatic, focused on their own interests, even if it means breaking the rules or using tactics. The West would consider totally unacceptable.
And the war in Ukraine is a prime example of that. The annexation of Crimea, the support for separatists, ignoring all the international condemnation. It all points to a very different approach to foreign policy.
Absolutely. And you've got Iran with their support for proxy groups across the Middle East, their involvement in the Syrian conflict, developing those ballistic missiles. The West has criticized all of that, but they just keep doing it.
So they're not just talking about a multipolar world. They're actively trying to create one, even if it means shaking things up and causing instability.
Exactly. And that's what worries the West so much about this partnership. It's not just two countries teaming up. It's a fundamental challenge to the entire power structure and everything it stands for.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about how this could affect specific regions. You mentioned the Middle East earlier. What are your thoughts on how this plays out there, given Iran's influence and all the conflicts already happening?
Oh, the Middle East is already a powder keg, And this deal could definitely make things even more volatile. Iran's already a major player in the region. They support all sorts of groups and militias in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, everywhere, really.
Right.
With Russia backing them up, their influence could easily grow even stronger.
So we could see a more aggressive Iran, emboldened by Russia, pushing their agenda even harder.
It's a real possibility. And that could increase tensions with their rivals like Saudi Arabia and Israel. We could see proxy wars heating up, existing conflicts escalating, and new ones breaking out.
And that's not even factoring in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's already so complicated and volatile. And then you've got Iran supporting Hamas and other Palestinian groups that oppose Israel. It just adds another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. And Russia's role is, well, kind of murky. They've tried to act like a mediator in the conflict, but they have also got their own interests to think about. They've given weapons to both Israel and their Arab neighbors, and they've maintained close ties with the Palestinian Authority.
It's a mess,
Yeah.
basically, a tangled web of relationships. And this new partnership is just going to make it even more complicated. It's hard to imagine this leading to anything but more instability and conflict in the region.
It's definitely concerning, yeah. But we have to remember that the Middle East has a long history of conflict and shifting alliances. This new partnership might not completely change the game, but it'll definitely add a new dimension to an already volatile situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the Middle East. What about Europe? How is this new partnership likely to affect European countries, especially with the war in Ukraine and all the sanctions against Russia?
Oh, Europe is watching this very closely with a lot of anxiety, I'd say. They're already on edge because of what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And this partnership with Iran just ramps up that anxiety even more.
I bet they're especially worried about this partnership undermining the sanctions they've put on Russia.
Absolutely. The economic side of this deal is huge. That north-south transport corridor we talked about, that could give Russia a big economic lifeline, letting them bypass Western sanctions and get into new markets.
So not only could this make Russia bolder politically and militarily, but it could actually help their economy too, make them less vulnerable to pressure from the West. That's got to be a major worry for European leaders who are trying to isolate Russia and force them to change course.
Exactly. It puts them in a really tough spot. They want to stay united against Russia, but they also have to think about their own economic interests and energy security.
It's a balancing act, for sure. And they can't ignore the security implications either. Russia getting closer to Iran, a country that has literally called for the destruction of Israel and has been accused of backing terrorism, that's going to set off alarm bells all over Europe.
For sure. It raises serious questions about what Russia's long-term goals are and whether this partnership could destabilize the whole European security order. Some analysts are even saying this alliance could be a step towards a bigger geopolitical realignment, like with Russia and China forming a bloc to challenge the West.
Okay, so let's talk about China for a minute. You mentioned the potential impact on the relationship between Russia and China. Can you expand on that a bit? How do you see this playing out in Asia with China's growing influence there?
The relationship between Russia and China is complicated. They do have some things in common, like wanting to challenge that U.S.-led world order and promoting their own styles of government. And they've been working together more on the economic and military fronts in recent years.
But they're also competing, right? They both want influence in Asia and they have different strategic goals.
Exactly. Russia might see this Iran partnership as a way to balance out China's growing power in Asia. By strengthening ties with Iran, Russia gets a foothold in the Middle East and access to those crucial energy resources, making them less dependent on China.
Like a strategic hedge. Russia's not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Precisely. And this could create some friction between Russia and China. China might not be too happy about Russia getting closer to Iran, especially since Iran has historically been closer to Beijing.
It's like a global love triangle. But seriously, this adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated geopolitical situation. Every move Russia makes seems to have ripple effects around the world.
That's what happens in a multipolar world. Power is more spread out, alliances are more fluid, and it's harder to predict what the consequences of actions will be.
And we're all caught in the middle of it, trying to make sense of this constantly changing landscape. It can feel pretty overwhelming trying to keep up with it all.
I get that, but that's exactly why these kinds of discussions are so important. We break down these complex issues, and we try to make sense of the world around us.
I totally agree. And I think we've done a good job of that so far. We've looked at this Russia-Iran partnership from all sides, the motivations, the potential good stuff, and the big risks involved. We've talked about the clash of civilizations, the rise of a multipolar world, and the possibilities for both conflict and cooperation. But I want to focus on a question that's been bugging me this whole time. What does all this mean for us, for regular people, living in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable and shaky?
That's the question, isn't it? It's impossible to say for sure what will happen, but I think there are a few things we've talked about that can help us understand this new reality.
Okay, I'm listening. What should we be watching out for? What are the things that should keep us up at night?
First, I think we need to realize that the world is entering a new era of geopolitical competition. The old rules are going out the window, and new power centers are emerging. This is going to lead to more uncertainty, more volatility, and more potential for conflict.
So buckle up, basically.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. We can't just assume that the relative peace and stability we've had lately will last forever.
Okay, that's a bit sobering. What else should we be thinking about?
Second, it's crucial to understand that this competition isn't just about power and resources, it's about ideas and values, too. We're witnessing a clash between different worldviews, different visions for the future.
Like that clash of civilizations we were talking about.
Exactly. And this clash is going to play out everywhere, not just on battlefields, but in the media, in schools, online. It's going to shape how we see the world, what we believe, and how we understand things.
So we need to be more careful, more critical of the information we're taking in, and more aware of the different stories being told.
Yeah.
We can't just passively absorb information. We need to be active participants in figuring out what's true.
Absolutely. We need to have real conversations, question assumptions, and seek out diverse viewpoints. We have to be critical thinkers, not just followers.
Okay, so we need to be ready for a more turbulent world, and we need to be more discerning about the information we're consuming. What else?
Well, it's important to remember that we're not just watching this all happen. We have a say, we have a voice, and we can make a difference.
So we're not totally powerless. We can actually do something to shape how things turn out.
Exactly. We can support organizations that are promoting peace and understanding. We can have constructive conversations with people who see things differently. And we can push for policies that encourage cooperation and diplomacy.
So it's not just about bracing for impact, it's about working to create a better future.
Exactly. And that's a hopeful message I think we should all remember.
It is hopeful. It's a good reminder that even when things feel uncertain and chaotic, we can choose hope over fear, dialogue over division, and action over apathy.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in all the negativity and forget that we have some control over how we react to all of this. You know, we were talking earlier about the downsides of this whole Russia-Iran thing, the risks of more conflict and instability. But is there anything good that could come out of it? Could this alliance actually lead to some positive developments?
That's a really interesting question, and one that I think often gets overlooked. We tend to focus on the worst-case scenarios and forget that international relations are rarely so straightforward.
Right.
Even alliances that seem unlikely can sometimes lead to unexpected, even positive outcomes.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate here. What are some of the potential upsides? What good things could come from this partnership?
Well, for one, it could actually contribute to more stability in some regions. Think about Syria, for example. Both Russia and Iran have been deeply involved in that conflict, but on opposite sides. Yeah, they've been backing different groups, pursuing their own agendas, which has just made the whole situation even more complicated.
Exactly. But now, with this strategic partnership, there's at least a chance that they could start coordinating their efforts and work towards some kind of negotiated settlement. Their combined influence could be a powerful force for peace if they choose to use it that way.
That would be huge, not just for the Syrian people, who have really suffered throughout this conflict, but for the whole region. A peaceful Syria could help stabilize the Middle East and reduce the flow of refugees into Europe.
Absolutely. And there are other areas where their cooperation could be beneficial. For example, both Russia and Iran are really concerned about terrorism. They've both been targets of attacks, and they both see extremist groups as a major threat.
Right. One of the articles mentioned their shared concerns about ISIS and other groups gaining ground in Central Asia and Afghanistan.
Exactly. If they pool their intelligence and coordinate their counterterrorism efforts, they could potentially make real progress in fighting this common enemy.
So while this partnership definitely carries risks, there are also potential benefits we shouldn't ignore. It all comes down to how they decide to use their power and influence.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that this partnership isn't fixed or static. It's going to change over time, influenced by all sorts of factors: internal and external pressures, the personalities of the leaders, the global political landscape.
It's kind of like watching a game of chess, isn't it? Each move has consequences, and you can never be entirely sure how it's going to end.
That's a great analogy. And as observers, our job is to stay informed, analyze what's happening, and consider all the possibilities, both good and bad.
Well said. And I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We've really explored this Russia-Iran partnership in depth. Their motives, the potential benefits, and the risks it poses to the world as we know it. We've talked about the clash of civilizations, the rise of a multipolar world, and the possibilities for both conflict and cooperation. But more than anything, I hope we've highlighted the importance of being informed and thinking critically. The world is changing fast, and we can't afford to sit back and just watch it happen. We all have a part to play in shaping the future, whether it's supporting organizations working towards peace, having honest conversations with people who have different viewpoints, or simply staying informed and questioning our own assumptions.
I couldn't agree more. The future isn't set in stone. It's shaped by the choices we make today.
And on that note, we'll conclude our deep dive into the Russia-Iran strategic partnership. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. We encourage you to keep learning and engaging with this complex and ever-changing issue. Remember, in a world full of uncertainty, knowledge is power.